The napkin was wrinkled. It had a coffee ring on the corner, and a small tear near the edge where she had pressed too hard with the pen. It was the kind of napkin you find at a diner that had been open since 1987 and has never once changed the color of its booths. The kind of napkin that nobody saves, nobody frames, nobody keeps, but somebody did, and that somebody had more money than most countries. Here is what nobody knew about that napkin. Here is what nobody knew about the woman who wrote on it. And here is what nobody, not the gossip blogs, not the financial magazines, not even people closest to both of them, could have ever predicted would happen next. This is a story about a woman who was done. Done with pretending. Done with smiling at people who looked through her. Done with a world that told her to be grateful for scraps while other people ate at tables she would never be invited to sit at. This is a story about a man who had everything and had somehow ended up with nothing that mattered. And this is a story of a napkin, a cheap, wrinkled, coffee-stained napkin that became the most honest thing either of them had ever encountered. Before this story goes any further, if you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever sat in a diner at the end of a terrible day and felt like the whole world had forgotten you existed, if you have ever been angry at a life that seemed to be happening to everyone except you, then this story was written for you. And before we go one word further into the story, if you are watching this and you feel something already, please subscribe right now. Share this with someone who needs to feel seen today. And drop a comment below telling us the last time you felt truly, completely, honestly done. Because this story is for every single one of you. Now, let's go back to that diner. Her name was Clara. Clara May Hutchins, 41 years old, 5'4", brown hair that she cut herself because the salon cost $40 and she had $37 in her checking account at the time of her last haircut. She worked double shifts at Mercer's Diner in a small town called Sable Creek, Virginia. Population 6,212. One stoplight, one pharmacy, one diner, and one woman who was at the absolute end of her rope on the night. Everything changed. It was a Tuesday in October. The kind of October where the air smells like wood smoke and something ending. Clara had been on her feet for 11 hours. She had spilled coffee on her left shoe at 7 in the morning, and her sock had been wet all day. She had smiled at a man who snapped his fingers at her to get her attention. She had remade a burger 3 times because a customer kept changing his mind. She had listened to 2 men in business suits at Table 7 talk about their portfolios and their second homes and their bonuses for 45 minutes while she refilled their water glasses, and they did not once look at her face. Not once. She was furniture to them. She was a hand that poured the water. She was background noise. At 9:47 in the evening, the diner was almost empty. Mercer himself had gone home early. The cook, a quiet man named Gil, was finishing the last cleanup in the back. Clara was wiping down the counter. Her feet hurt so badly she had stopped being able to feel her toes. Her lower back felt like someone had replaced her spine with a metal rod and then hit it with a hammer. She sat down on the stool behind the counter, the one Mercer always told her not to sit on because it looked unprofessional. And she just sat there for a moment, just breathed, and then she reached for a napkin from the dispenser on the counter, and she picked up the pen she kept in her apron pocket, the same pen she used to write down orders, the same pen that had written thousands of orders over 7 years at this diner. Scrambled eggs, BLT, coffee black, pie to go. She pressed the pen to the napkin, and she wrote 4 words. I hate rich men. She sat there and looked at it, and then she kept writing. Because once she started, she could not stop. She wrote in small, cramped letters, filling the napkin from edge to edge. She wrote everything. All of it. 7 years of it. She wrote about the men who never looked at her face. She wrote about the way money made some people believe they were better than everyone else. She wrote about the way she had once had dreams. Real ones. The kind that keep you up at night not with worry but with excitement. And how those dreams have been slowly worn down by years of wet socks and snapped fingers and water glasses and $37 in a checking account. She wrote until the napkin was full. And then she looked at it for a long moment. And she folded it once, leave it on the counter, put on her coat, said goodnight to Gil, and walked out to her car. A 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked rear taillight and 187,000 miles on it. She drove home. She fed her cat, a large orange tabby named Walter. She sat on the edge of her bed and she took off her wet sock and she looked at her wrinkled foot for a moment and felt an exhaustion that had nothing to do with her feet. She did not think about the napkin again, but the napkin was not done. The next morning, a man came into Mercer's diner for the first time in his life. His name was James Calloway. Not Jamie, not Jim, James. He had told people that since he was 8 years old, and he had not stopped telling them since. James Calloway was 46 years old, 6'1", gray at the temples in the way that magazines described as distinguished. He wore a watch that cost more than Clara's car. He wore it the way most people wore a watch, meaning he did not think about it at all. It had simply always been there, the way certain things are simply always there when you have never had to think about whether you could afford them. James Calloway was, by every measurable standard, one of the most successful men in the eastern United States. He had built a technology company from a 2-room office in Richmond, Virginia 20 years ago into a company now valued at $4.3 billion. He had been on the cover of 3 magazines. He had been quoted in the Wall Street Journal 14 times in the past year alone. He had a home in McLean, a penthouse in New York, a property in the Outer Banks that he had not visited in 2 years, and an apartment in London that he had visited exactly once. He had everything. He was driving from Richmond to a meeting in Charlottesville when something went wrong with the car. Not his car. He didn't drive himself. He had a driver named Paul who had worked for him for 9 years, but Paul's car, the black SUV that had been James's reliable transportation for almost a decade. Something under the hood. A sound like something tearing. Paul pulled off the highway onto the nearest exit, and they found themselves on a 2-lane road in a small town neither of them had ever heard of. Sable Creek, Virginia. The mechanic shop was 3 blocks from Mercer's diner. The mechanic told Paul it would be at least 3 hours. Paul relayed this to James. James looked at the mechanic shop, looked at his phone, looked at the one stoplight in the center of town, and made a decision that would change both of their lives. He walked to the diner. He had not eaten in a real diner, and he tried to remember and could not. Years, many years. His life had become a series of restaurants with names that required reservations and menus without prices listed. He had forgotten what it felt like to sit in a vinyl booth. He sat in the booth at table 4, Clara's section. Clara was already there when he came in. She had been there since 6. She had not noticed anything different about this Tuesday morning, except that her left knee had started making a new sound going upstairs. She came to table 4 with a menu and a glass of water, and she set them down without looking up. She said the coffee was fresh, and the pie was apple today, and the eggs were good. She said it the way she had said it 10,000 times. On autopilot, the way your mouth does a thing your brain stopped supervising years ago. James said he would have coffee. Black. Clara wrote it down. She still wrote everything down even though she had memorized the menu years ago. It was a habit, the pen on the pad. It made her feel like she was doing something official. She went and got the coffee. She came back and set it down. He said, "Thank you." And here is the thing. Here is the small, unremarkable, completely ordinary thing that was also somehow not ordinary at all. He looked at her face when he said it. He actually looked, not through her, not past her, at her, for 1/2 of 1 second. He was just a person thanking another person. Clara noticed. She noticed the way you notice something small that you did not expect, the way you notice a strange kindness from a stranger, and it catches you off guard, and then you move on, because you are 11 hours into a shift, and there is a table 6 that needs more ketchup. She moved on. James drank his coffee and looked at his phone for a while. He answered 3 emails. He read a report his assistant had sent him. He looked out the window at the one stoplight and watched it go from red to green to yellow to red to green, and he thought about nothing in particular, which was unusual for him because James Calloway almost never thought about nothing in particular. His brain was typically running at a speed that his therapist, a woman he paid $400 an hour and had not called in 6 months, had once described as unsustainable. But there in that booth, with a coffee that was just coffee, no pour-over, no single origin, no artisan anything, just coffee, he felt his brain slowed down. He looked around the diner. He looked at the counter. He saw the napkin. It was still there from the night before. Clara had left it folded on the counter and gone home, and Gil had cleaned the grill and the surfaces but had left the counter items as they were because it was not his section. And Mercer had not come in yet, and Clara had been so busy since she arrived at 6 that she had not gone back to the counter area to clear it. James was not close enough to read it. He could see it was a folded napkin with writing on it. He did not know what made him get up and go look at it. He would try to explain this later, and he would not be able to. He just got up. He walked over. He picked it up and unfolded it. He read 4 words, and then he kept reading. He stood there at the counter of Mercer's Diner in Sable Creek, Virginia, with a napkin in his hands, and he read every single word. And when he finished, he stood very still for a moment. His face did not move. James Calloway had spent 20 years in boardrooms learning how to keep his face from moving. But something moved inside him, something he had not felt in a long time, something that felt like he had to search for the word. Recognition, not of himself, but of something true, something so honestly, painfully true that it hit him the way cold water hits you when you've been too warm for too long. He folded the napkin carefully. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, next to his chest. He went back to his booth. He finished his coffee. He left a $50 bill on the table and walked out before Clara came back to refill it. Clara came back, saw the 50, thought he had left it by accident, ran to the door, and watched the black SUV pull away from curb. She stood in the doorway, holding the $50 bill. She looked at it. She went back inside and put it in her pocket, and did not think about him again. She looked for the napkin. It was gone. She assumed it had been thrown away. She put on a fresh pot of coffee. She went back to work. 3 weeks later, a woman named Diane Chu walked into Mercer's Diner. Diane Chu was 40 years old, very small, very sharp, and she worked as James Calloway's chief of staff. She had worked for him for 11 years. She knew things about him that his ex-wife did not know. She knew the way he took his coffee and the meetings he dreaded and the rare moments when he laughed, really laughed, unexpectedly, at something absurd, and those moments made everyone in the room feel warm. She was not his friend. She was careful about that distinction, the way people in her position had to be careful, but she was a person in the world who probably understood him most clearly. Diane had been sent to Sable Creek with a task that she had written down in her notes as simply, Napkin Woman. She had no other information. James had called her from the Charlottesville meeting 3 weeks ago, after the car was fixed and Paul had driven the rest of the way, and he had said, "There's a diner in Sable Creek. Find out who works there. Find out who was working the counter on the night of Tuesday, October 14th. Do it quietly. Just find out who she is." Diane was very good at her job. She had found out exactly who she was. She walked into Mercer's Diner at 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday and sat in Clara's section and ordered a piece of apple pie, which she did not eat, and a cup of coffee, which she did. She watched Clara work. She watched Clara refill someone's water without being asked. She watched Clara remember that the man at table 2 was allergic to onions without looking at his ticket. She watched Clara break off a piece of her own granola bar behind the counter and slip it to a little girl whose mother was too busy with a phone call to notice the child was hungry. She watched Clara do all of this without ceremony, without announcement, without any expectation that anyone would notice. Diane pulled out her phone and typed a message to James. The message said, "I found her. Her name is Clara Hutchins. She is exactly what you would expect from those words, and also nothing like what you would expect. You should come." James's response came 4 minutes later. It was one word. When he did not come immediately, he waited another week. He told himself it was because of his schedule, which was genuinely impossible. 3 board meetings, a trip to New York, a quarterly review that had required 17 preparatory calls. He told himself there was nothing unusual about this, that he was simply following up on something that had caught his attention. He was a man who paid attention to things that caught his attention. That was how he had built a $4 billion company. You notice things. You follow them. He told himself all of this. He also took the napkin out of his jacket pocket twice during that week, just to read it again. He had a jacket wardrobe that rotated on a schedule his assistant managed. He moved the napkin to a different jacket each time. He did not examine why he was doing this. On a Thursday in early November, James Calloway drove himself. Actually drove himself, no Paul, a thing he had not done in years, back to Sable Creek, Virginia. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans that his stylist had picked out 3 years ago, and he had never worn because they were too casual. He left his watch at home. He drove a car from the back of his garage, a 10-year-old Jeep that had belonged to his younger brother, and that James had kept for reasons he had never articulated clearly. He drove 2 hours to a small town with one stoplight. He walked into Mercer's Diner at 11:45 in the morning. He sat at table 4 again. Clara came to his table. She looked at him the way she looked at anyone new in this town. A quick assessment. A smile that was professional and genuine in equal parts. A menu and a glass of water. She said the coffee was fresh. He said he would have coffee and whatever was good. She said the meatloaf was good. He said that sounded fine. She wrote it down and went to get the coffee, and James sat there looking out at the one stoplight and feeling something he had not felt in a very long time. Nervous. He was nervous, which was ridiculous. He had presented to rooms full of investors who controlled more wealth than some nations, and he had not been nervous. He had testified before a Senate subcommittee, and he had not been nervous. He was sitting in a vinyl booth in a diner in a town with a population of 6,000 people, and his heart was beating fast. Clara came back with the coffee. She set it down. He said, "Thank you." She looked at his face when he said it, and there was something, a half second of something, where she thought she recognized him. Not his name, not who he was, just the particular way he looked at her when he said those 2 words. She had the sudden feeling she had seen those eyes before, not in a romantic movie way, in a more unsettling way, in the way you feel when something familiar turns up somewhere it has no business being. She pushed the feeling aside. She had tables to run. He ate the meatloaf. It was genuinely very good. He could not remember the last time he had eaten something that straightforward and felt dissatisfied by it. He ate slowly. He drank 2 cups of coffee. He watched the diner fill up with the lunch crowd. He watched Clara move through her section with that particular efficiency that looked effortless only because she had been doing it for so long. He watched her talk to the regular at the end of the counter, an old man with a hearing aid who seemed to come in every day, and he watched her lean in close. So the old man didn't have to strain, and he watched her laugh at something the old man said, and the laugh was real, completely real, unperformed. He sat in that booth for 2 hours. He left a $100 bill under his coffee cup. He came back the next Thursday, and the Thursday after that. By the 4th Thursday, Clara had noticed. She had noticed the way you notice a pattern without meaning to, the way your brain files things quietly even when you're not paying attention. Same booth, same time, same order, except the 3rd time he had asked for the apple pie too. Flannel shirt, different colors but same kind of shirt. No phone visible, she had noticed that because every single customer she had was attached to their phone, and this man left his in his pocket. He looked out the window. He read sometimes, a paperback book, the old kind with a worn spine like it had been read before. He did not hurry. She did not know who he was. She had not looked him up. She was not the kind of person who Googled the strangers who sat in her section. She was the kind of person who had too much actual life to be that interested in the hypothetical lives of people passing through. But she had given him a name in her head, the way you do with regulars. She called him Thursday in her head, which was not creative but was accurate. On the 4th Thursday, she did something she rarely did with customers. She lingered. She had refilled his coffee, and she was standing there with the pot, and she said, "You are not from here?" It was not a question. He said no. She said, "He drove a long way for meatloaf." He looked up at her then, full face, both eyes, and he smiled. And the smile was unexpected because it was not the kind of smile she was used to seeing from men in flannel shirts who drove 2 hours to small-town diners. It was not charming. It was not practiced. It was a smile of someone who had just been caught doing something they could not fully explain and knew it and found it funny. He said the meatloaf was worth it. She said Gil would be glad to hear that. Gil was the cook. She said, "I looked you up this week. 6 years of not Googling customers, and I broke my record for you." She said, "I need know why you are sitting in this booth every Thursday." He looked at her for a long moment. She held eye contact. She had spent 7 years maintaining eye contact with people who were trying not to see her. She was extremely good at it. He said, "Can I show you something?" She said yes. He reached into the inside pocket of his flannel shirt. He was always wearing a shirt with a front pocket, she realized now, every single Thursday, and he took out something folded, small, white, a little wrinkled. He put it on the table between them. She looked at it. She knew it was before she unfolded it. She knew from the size. She knew from the coffee ring on the corner. She knew from the small tear near the edge. She unfolded it anyway. She read the 4 words at the top. "I hate rich men." She read all the rest of it. Her own words. 7 years of her own words. She sat there in the booth across from the most successful man she had ever been in the same room with, and she read her own exhaustion back to herself. Her face did not move. This was something Clara May Hutchins and James Calloway had in common. They had both learned to keep their faces still. When she finished reading, she folded the napkin very carefully and set it back on the table between them, and she looked at him. She said, "You took my napkin." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because it was the most honest thing I had read in years." She looked at him. He said, "I have people who are paid specifically to tell me things. Analysts, advisors, consultants. I pay some of them more per day than most people make in a month, and they tell me things in language so carefully constructed that by the time I am done hearing it, I have no idea what the truth actually is." He said, "Your napkin was the truth, just the truth. No packaging." She said, "It was a bad day." He said, "I know." He said, "That is what made it true." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the napkin. She looked back at him. She said, "So you drove 2 hours every Thursday because of a napkin." He said, "I drove 2 hours every Thursday because of the person who wrote it." The refrigerator hummed. Someone at table 2 asked for more water, and Clara held up one finger, without looking away from James, and the person at table 2 waited. She said, "What do you want from me?" He said, "I don't want anything from you." He said it the same way he had said "thank you" that first morning, direct and genuine with nothing behind it. He said, "I wanted to meet the person who was that honest. I wanted to sit in the room with someone who said exactly what they meant." He said, "I have not done that in a very long time." She said, "You framed it." He went still, very still. She said, "Diane." She said, "Your chief of staff came in here 3 weeks after you took the napkin." She was trying to be subtle, but she sat in my section for an hour and ate nothing and watched me like she was taking notes. I looked her up too this week. When I looked you up, she said, "Diane told you something about me, and you did something with that napkin. Did you frame it?" He said yes. Clara said nothing. She looked out the window at the one stoplight, going through its colors. She said, "That is the strangest thing anyone has ever done to something I wrote." He said, "It is the most important thing anyone has written in my office in 20 years. She looked back at him. She said, "Your office?" He said yes. She said, "It is hanging in your office right now." He said yes. She said, "A $4 billion man has a diner napkin hanging in his office that says, 'I hate rich men.'" He said yes. She let out a long, slow breath. She picked up the coffee pot from the table. She stood up from the booth. She looked down at him. She said, "Your meatloaf will be out in 10 minutes. She walked away. She walked back to the counter. She put the coffee pot down. She gripped the edge of the counter with both hands, and she stood there for a moment looking at the wall. Gil came through from the kitchen and looked at her and said, "You all right?" She said, "Yeah." She said, "Put in a meatloaf for table 4. She stood there for another moment. Then she straightened up and smoothed her apron, and she picked up the coffee pot, and she went back to work. That Thursday changed the temperature between them. Something shifted, not dramatically, not the way things shift in movies where the music swells and the lighting changes. The way things shift in real life, which is quietly and without announcement, and you only notice it days later when you're doing something else entirely. She stopped calling him Thursday in her head. She started calling him James. He started coming in on Thursdays, and also sometimes on Tuesdays. Not every Tuesday, just some. The way you add a day to your routine, when the routine has started meaning something. They talked more, not long conversations, Just the kind of talking that happens in the margin of someone's work. She would stop at his table for 3 minutes between tables. She would say something. He would say something back. Short exchanges, like messages passed in a hallway. She told him about Roy and his standing order, and Roy told her one day that her young man had come in on a Tuesday and had sat with him for 20 minutes, and that he liked him. Roy said, "He listens the way people used to listen, which is all the way." Clara did not say he was not her young man. She just refilled Roy's coffee and let it go. James told her, in pieces, across several weeks, things she had not known. He told her the company had started in a room the size of her car. He told her the first year he ate rice because it was cheap, and he was too proud to tell anyone he was struggling. He told her that the fourth year he made his first $1 million, and he had stood in his apartment alone and felt. He paused there. He looked for the word. He said, empty. He said he had expected to feel something enormous, and what he felt instead was enormous nothing. She said, and now? He said, now I have more of it. She said, the emptiness. He said, yes. She looked at him the way she had looked at the napkin. He asked if she had been working there long. She said, 7 years. He said, 7 years is a long time. She said, not if you like the work. He asked if she liked the work, and she looked at him for a moment, really looked, the way she looked at the napkin 3 weeks ago, direct and unvarnished. She said some of it. He said, which part? She said, Gil's meatloaf and the old man at the end of the counter. His name is Roy, and he comes in every day and orders the same thing, and every single day he acts like it is the best thing he has ever eaten. She said, that part one like. James looked at her for a moment. He said, what is Roy's order? And Clara told him, 2 eggs over easy, white toast, coffee with 2 sugars. And Roy says thank you like he means it every single time. James said, some people do. Clara looked at him again. That half second again. That feeling. She said, most don't. She walked away and refilled Roy's coffee. James watched her do it and watched Roy's face light up, and he sat there for a while longer than he meant to. He left $150 under his coffee cup. Clara found it when she cleared the table. She stood there looking at it. She looked at the door. He was gone. She picked it up and held it and felt something complicated. Not gratitude. Not quite. Something more like being seen and not knowing how to feel about that. She put it in her pocket. She went back to work. On the 5th Thursday, he told her his first name. He said it the way you say something that you've been holding back for a while. Not dramatically, just quietly, like setting something down. He said, my name is James. She said, I'm Clara. He said, I know. She stopped. She looked at him. She said, how do you know my name? He said, it is on your name tag. She looked down at the small plastic name tag she had worn every day for 7 years and completely stopped seeing. She almost laughed. She did smile. A real one, surprised out of her. She said, Clara May Hutchins, in case you needed the rest of it. He said, James David Calloway, in case you needed the rest of it. She said, nice to meet you, James David Calloway. She walked away. He sat there for a moment with a feeling in his chest that he examined the way you examine something fragile, carefully, without pressing too hard. He came back the following Thursday, and the following one after that. It was 6 Thursdays and before Mercer himself said something. Mercer was a 68-year-old man with the kind of face that had been weathered into something trustworthy. He had owned this diner for 31 years. He had watched a lot of people come and go. He had a particular talent for knowing things about people that they had not told him. The way people who had spent enough years watching other people develop that talent without trying. He said to Clara one Thursday evening after closing, that man who comes in every week. Clara said she knew which one he meant. Mercer said he recognized him. Clara said she didn't. Mercer said James Calloway. He'd built Calloway Systems. It is worth. Mercer named a number. A very large number. The kind of number that does not connect to anything real in your brain, the way distances in space don't connect to anything real. You hear it, but you cannot feel it. Clara stood very still. She said, how do you know that? Mercer said, I looked him up. After the 3rd Thursday, I looked him up because men in flannel shirts don't tip like that unless something's going on. Clara thought about the tips. The $100 bills. She had been putting them in a separate pocket of her purse, not mixing them with her regular tips, as if they were a different category of thing, as if she had not decided what category they were yet. She said, "Why is he coming here?" Mercer said he didn't know. He said, "I figured you might." Clara thought about it. She thought about Thursday, about the flannel shirts, about the way he looked out the window, about the way he said thank you and meant it, about the paperback books, about the smile when she caught him coming back for the fourth week. She said, "I have no idea." Mercer looked at her for a long moment. He said, "All right." He said it the way people say things when they have decided not to say the bigger thing they are thinking. He turned off the lights in the back and went home. Clara sat on the stool behind the counter, the one he always told her not to sit on, and she sat there alone in the diner in the quiet after closing, with the smell of coffee and the sound of the refrigerator humming, and she thought about a man worth $4 billion driving 2 hours every Thursday to eat meatloaf and sit at table 4. She felt something. She examined it the way you examine something you are not sure you should be feeling. Something between suspicion and curiosity. Something that was not comfortable, but was not entirely uncomfortable either. She turned off the last light and went home. She did not sleep well. The next Thursday, she was ready. She had thought about it all week. She had decided something. She had decided that if James Calloway, $4 billion James Calloway, magazine cover James Calloway, man who tipped $100 bills James Calloway, was coming to her diner every week, she was going to know why. She was not going to be furniture. She was not going to be the hand that poured the coffee. She was going to look him in the face and ask him directly. She was Clara May Hutchins. She had been on her feet for 7 years. She had worn wet socks without complaint. She had been invisible to rooms full of people who cost more per hour than she made in a week. She was done with polite pretending. He came in at 11:45. Same booth. She let him sit for 5 minutes. She let him get settled. Then she walked over with the coffee, and she poured it, and she set the pot down on the table, which was not professional, but she did not care, and she sat down across from him in the booth. She said, "Why are you here?" He looked at her. His face did not move, but his eyes did something. A slight adjustment, like a dial turning a fraction. He said, "I told you, the meatloaf is..." She said, "I know who you are." She said it without heat, just flat and clear. He was quiet for a moment. She said, "I know your name, not just James David. All of it. The company. The number with all the zeros. The magazines." She said, "I wrote that napkin on a bad day, but it wasn't really about rich men." She said, "It was about feeling like the world had two kinds of people, and I was always going to be in one kind and never the other, and nobody in the other kind even knew the first kind was there." He said, "I know." She said, "You can't know." She said it without cruelty, just as a fact. She said, "You have the watch and the car and the house." He said, "I know what invisibility feels like from the inside." He said, "It does not require poverty." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "That is the saddest thing anyone has said in this diner in 7 years, and that includes the Tuesday Roy told me his wife had died." James said nothing. She said, "I'm sorry." He said, "Don't be." He said, "Sad is fine. Sad is honest." She walked away to table 6. He sat there for a while. He left $200 under his coffee cup that day. She found it. She stood there looking at it. She thought about what he had said. She thought about invisibility from the inside. She put it in the separate pocket of her purse. Something happened on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving that neither of them was ready for. The diner was fuller than usual. It was midday, and people were doing the kind of pre-holiday errands that fill small towns up temporarily, and Mercer's was packed. Clara was running hard. 6 tables. The lunch rush at full speed. James had come in a Tuesday, one of the sometimes Tuesdays, and he was at table 4, and he could see she was stretched thin. He did something that he did not plan. He stood up. He walked to the counter where Mercer was standing watching the floor, and he said, "I can bust tables, if that helps." Mercer looked at him for a long time. Mercer was a man who trusted his instincts, and his instincts said this was genuine and also possibly insane. He handed James a gray plastic bus bin. James Calloway, for $0.3 billion, spent 45 minutes clearing plates and wiping tables and carrying the bin to the kitchen. He did not do it well at first. He stacked plates in a way that made Gil wince. But he got better. He was efficient by nature. He figured out the system. Clara saw him on her second pass through the floor. She stopped completely. She stood in the middle of her section holding a coffee pot, and she looked at James Calloway with his flannel shirt sleeves pushed up carrying a bus bin, and she felt something move through her chest so fast she almost didn't catch it. She caught it. She filed it carefully, in the separate pocket, the one she used for things she hadn't decided about yet. After the rush, when the floor cleared and it was just the three of them, Clara, James, and Mercer, Mercer poured 3 cups of coffee and put them on the counter, and they all sat there in the after-rush quiet. Mercer looked at James and said, "Not bad." James looked at his hands. He said, "My grandfather ran a hardware store. I used to stock shelves when I was 8. Clara said, "You never told me that." He said, "There are things you don't tell people until you are bussing tables in a diner." Mercer laughed. It was a good laugh, short and genuine. Clara looked at James over a coffee cup. He was looking at his own coffee, and there was something on his face that she had not seen before. Something younger. Something that looked like the person he had been before the company, and the billions, and the watch, and the invisible penthouse in New York. She thought about a boy's stocking shelves in his grandfather's hardware store. She thought about herself at 8, sitting at the same counter, actually, because her mother had worked here before her and had brought her in after school when there was no one to watch her. She said, "I used to sit at this counter when I was 8. She said, "My mom worked here." James looked up at her. She said, "She died when I was 12. She said it the way people say things they have said many times. The roughness worn down, just the shape of the thing left. She said, "After that I decided this was a place that kept something of her." She said, "That is why I stayed." The counter was very quiet. Mercer put his hand briefly over hers. Just for a moment. Paternal and wordless. James looked at his coffee. He said, "I'm sorry about your mother." Clara said, "She would have liked you." She said, "She liked people who said thank you and meant it." James looked up at her again. The one stoplight outside went from red to green. The first Thursday of December, he brought her something. He came in at 11:45 like always, but he had something under his arm. Not wrapped, just a thing under his arm. A book. Old. A paperback with a spine, so broken it was held together mostly by faith. He set it on the table. She came over with his coffee and looked at it. She said, "Is that?" He said, "Steinbeck." He said, "East of Eden." He said, "I have read it 7 times." He said, "The copy I had in here a few weeks ago was my 3rd copy because the first 2 fell apart." She touched the cover. She said, "I haven't read it." He said, "It is about a lot of things." He said, "Mostly it is about people trying to be good and what it cost them." She said, "That sounds hard to read." He said, "It is the best kind of hard." She put the book in her apron pocket. The book was too big for her apron pocket, so it stuck out at an angle, and she carried it like that for the rest of the afternoon, tilted, the thick old battered paperback jutting out her apron, while she moved through the room. James watched her from his booth and felt something he did not have a clean word for. She started reading it that night. She read 40 pages before she fell asleep, and Walter the cat stepped on the book, and she lost her page. She started again the next morning. She read it in a week. She read it the way Clara read things when something caught her, all the way through without pretense, sitting in her car in a parking lot during her break with the windows fogging up because it was December in Virginia. The following Thursday she put on his table when she brought his coffee. She said, "I finished it." He said, "What did you think?" She sat down across from him. She did not wait for permission or convenience. She just sat down. He had stopped being surprised by this. She said, "I think the thing about Kathy, the bad one, the woman who has no good in her, I think the point is not that she is evil." She said, "The point is that she cannot see past herself." She said, "She is not bad because she hates people. She is bad because she cannot imagine people." She said, "She looks at every person in the room, and all she can see is what they are to her. She cannot see what they are to themselves." James sat very still. She said, "I know some people like that. I have worked table for them for 7 years." He said, "I know people like that too." She said, "Do you look at people like that?" He said, "I used to." He said, "I didn't know I was doing it." He said, It takes someone being brutally honest with you and writing on a diner napkin to start to see it. She looked at him. She said, "The napkin." He said, "The napkin." She said, "You really hung it in your office?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I walk in there every morning and I see it, and it reminds me that there are people who look straight at the truth and write it down with no apology. And it reminds me that I stopped doing that somewhere around year 3 of the company, and I have been paying for it since." She said, "What do you mean you have been paying for it?" He said, "My ex-wife left 4 years ago." She said, "I had become someone she did not recognize." She said, "She used to know what I was thinking, and then one day she realized she hadn't known in years." He said, "I didn't argue with her because she was right." Clara said nothing. She looked out the window. The stoplight. He said, "I have an 8-year-old son. His name is Ben. He lives with his mother in McLean. I have him every other weekend and Wednesday nights when I am in town, which is—" He stopped. He said, "Not as often as I mean to be." Clara looked back at him. She said, "Ben is a good name." He said, "He is a good kid." He said, "He is the best thing I have ever done." He said, "And I am doing him badly." The way he said the last sentence was different from the other sentences. Flatter. More weight. Clara said, "You are here on a Thursday instead of in New York." He said, "Yes." She said, "You drove yourself." He said, "Yes." She said, "You bus tables at Thanksgiving." He said, "Yes." She said, "I think you are trying to remember something." He looked at her. She said, "I think you are trying to remember who you were before the number with all the zeros." He said nothing. His face was still. His eyes were not. She said, "The boys' stocking shelves." His face did something then. Very small. Almost nothing. But she had spent 7 years reading people across 2 feet of table space, and she could read the almost nothing. She got up. She picked up the coffee pot. She refilled his cup. She said, "Gil's making pot roast today. It is better than the meatloaf. I'll put one in for you." He said, "Thank you." She looked at him when she said it. She said, "I know." She walked away. 3 days before Christmas. Something happened that Clara had not prepared for. A car she had not seen before pulled up outside Mercer's. It was a nice car. Not the kind of nice that announces itself loudly, but the quiet kind, the kind that costs a great deal specifically in order to look like it does not need to announce that. A woman got out, early 40s, well put together, the kind of put together that is a result of spending money in ways you cannot point to specifically, just the sum of many invisible choices that accumulate into a general impression of ease. Clara knew who she was. She had seen the picture online when she did her research. James's ex-wife. Her name was Patricia. She walked into Mercer's, and she sat down at the counter, and she ordered a coffee, and she looked around the diner in a way that Clara recognized. She was cataloging it, trying to understand what this place was. Clara brought her the coffee. Patricia said, "You are Clara." Clara said, "Yes." Patricia said, "My name is—" Clara said, "I know who you are." Patricia looked at her. She had James's stillness in a different key, less controlled, more deliberate. She said, "I am not here to cause trouble." Clara said, "All right." Patricia said, "My son talks about this place." She said, "Ben." He said his dad takes him here sometimes on Wednesday nights when they are in town. She said, "Ben told me there's a woman named Clara who saves him a piece of pie and always remembers he likes his apple pie warm." Clara had not known James brought Ben in on Wednesday nights. He had not mentioned it, but it did not surprise her. Ben had been to the diner twice that she could remember, a small boy with his father's careful eyes and his mother's easy smile, and she had given him warm pie both times because all children deserve warm pie. She said Ben is a sweet kid. Patricia said he is. They looked at each other across the counter. Patricia said, "Are you in love with my ex-husband?" Clara said, "I beg your pardon." Patricia said, "I am not asking it to be territorial." She said, "We have been divorced for 4 years, and I have moved on in every way that matters." She said, "I am asking because my son has started talking about his father differently." She said, "Ben says his dad laughs now." She said, "For the past 2 years, I was starting to worry that James had forgotten how." She looked at her coffee cup. She said, "I know about the napkin." Clara said nothing. Patricia said, "Diane told me." She said, Diane has worked for James for 11 years, and she has never once in 11 years called me about anything outside of logistics. She called me in November. She said she thought I should know what was happening because she was worried James was going to make a mess of it, and someone should give him— Patricia smiled, small and complicated. Someone should give him some information. Clara said, "What information?" Patricia said that he has not been happy in a very long time. She said, "Before we got married, he was different. He was still driven, and he still worked too much, but he was present. He looked at people. He laughed." She said, "And then the company got very big very fast, and he disappeared into it, and the man who came home every night was technically there, but not actually there." She said, "I did not leave because I stopped loving him. I left because I could not reach him anymore." She said, "It was like trying to talk to a window." Clara looked at her coffee pot. Patricia said, "And now Ben comes home from his Wednesday nights, and he tells me his dad sat with an old man named Roy for an hour and asked him about his wife who passed, and actually listened." She said, "Ben says his dad carried boxes in the back for Gil because Gil's back was bothering him." She said, "Ben says his dad is different." Clara said, "He is the same." She said it quietly. She said, "I think he is just remembering." Patricia looked at her. She said, "Don't let him forget again." She left $12 on the counter for a $4 coffee, and she walked out. Clara stood at the counter for a long time after that. Walter's bowl at home needed to be refilled, and her left knee was making that new sound, and she had $47 in her checking account, and the heating unit in her apartment was unreliable in December. She had a real life with real weight and real difficulty, and she was standing in a diner at the edge of something she had not asked to stand at the edge of. She thought about the boys' stocking shelves. She thought about the napkin in the frame. She thought about Ben's apple pie, warm. She said, to nobody in particular, to Gil who was clanking around in the back, to Walter who was at home on her bed, to her mother who had once stood behind the same counter. She said, well. She put on a fresh pot of coffee. Christmas Eve, James came in. She had not expected him. The diner was only open for a half day on Christmas Eve, and she had been there since 6, and it was 10:30, and she was planning to close up at noon and go home to Walter and a movie she had seen 3 times and a pot of soup she had made 2 days ago. He came in at 11. He was alone, not flannel today. A coat she didn't recognize. Dark. He looked different without the flannel, more like the person she had looked up on the internet, more like the man in the magazines. But he sat down in table 4. And when she brought his coffee, he looked at her the same way, that same way. So she let the coat go. She said, I didn't expect you today. He said, I didn't plan to come. He said, Ben is with his mother through New Year's. He said, I was at the house, and it was. He looked at his coffee. He said, quiet. She said, lonely quiet or peaceful quiet. He said, lonely. She said, do you want a piece of apple pie? He said, yes. She brought him a piece. Warm. She brought herself a piece, too, and she sat down across from him because the diner was almost empty and Mercer had gone home and Gil was cleaning up and the world outside was that particular gray-white of December in Virginia. They ate apple pie across from each other, and she thought about how this was the most ordinary thing she had done in a long time. 2 people pied December. How much the ordinary could cost. Sometimes. He said, what do you do for Christmas? She said, Walter and I watch the same movie I have watched for 8 years, and I eat the soup I make every Christmas Eve, because it was my mother's recipe, and that is enough. He said, what soup? She said, chicken and rice. Very simple. He said, that sounds perfect. She said, it is. He said, I haven't had a real Christmas in years. He said, I have done Christmas, meaning I have been present for it, and arranged it, and managed it. But having it, being in it, that is different. She said, you are in a diner eating apple pie on Christmas Eve. She said, that is pretty real. He looked at her. He said, yes. He said it the way you say yes to something that just explained itself to you. They finished the pie. She cleared the plates. She started to get up, and he said her name. Clara. She sat back down. He said, I want to tell you something. She waited. He said, when I found that napkin, I knew nothing about you. He said, I knew the handwriting and the words and the specific honesty of someone who would ignore for long enough that they stopped caring who saw the truth. He said, I came back here because I wanted to meet the person who wrote it. He said, and I met you and you were... He stopped. She waited. She was good at waiting. 7 years of waiting for orders, for people to make up their minds, for the next thing. He said, you are more. She looked at him. He said, you are more than the napkin. He said, you are the most real person I have encountered in longer than I can tell you, and I don't know how to. He stopped again. He said, I am very bad at this. He said, I have had 12-hour days in which I made decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and I have never once stumbled on my words the way I stumbled talking to you. She said, that is because with $100 million decisions, the stakes are just money. He said, what are the stakes here? She looked at him for a long moment. She said, I am a waitress in a diner in a town with one stoplight. She said, I make $11 an hour plus tips, and some weeks the tips are good, and some weeks I eat cereal for dinner. She said, I am 41 years old, and I have calluses on my feet and a cat and a car with 187,000 miles on it. She said, I don't own anything you would recognize as valuable, and I have not taken vacation in 4 years. She said, I am telling you this not because I am ashamed of it, but because you need to see it clearly before you say whatever you are about to say. He said, I see it. She said, do you? He said, I see you. Not your car, not your checking account. She watched his face. He said, I see a woman who stayed in a diner for 7 years because it kept something of her mother. I see someone who remembers how Roy takes his eggs, and that Ben likes his pie warm. I see someone who wrote the truth on a napkin at the end of a bad day, because the truth matters even when nobody is watching. He said, that is what I see. Clara May Hutchins, who had not cried in a diner since the Tuesday Roy told her his wife had died, felt something behind her eyes that she pressed down firmly. She said, James. He said, yes. She said, I need you to know that I have no idea what to do with any of this. He said, neither do I. He said, I haven't known what to do with any of it since October 14th. She said, that was the night I wrote the napkin. He said, I know. She looked at her hands on the table. She said, your ex-wife came in here. He went very still. She told him. She told him about Patricia and the coffee and Ben talking about the laughter. She told him what Patricia had said about the window. She did not protect him from any of it. She told him the way she told the truth, completely, without packaging. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. He said, she wasn't wrong. He said, about the window. He said, I knew she was right when she said it. I knew it the whole time. She said, what happened to you? She said, not the company story. The real thing. He looked out the window. The stoplight. He said, I had a brother. His name was Tom. He was 3 years younger. He died when I was 28. Hit by a drunk driver on a Tuesday morning in November. He said, I was already building the company by then. After Tom died, he stopped. He looked at his hands. He said, I stopped being present. It was easier. He said, the company needed all of me, and I gave it all of me because being all the way in the company meant I did not have to be in the grief. Clara said nothing. He said, that was 18 years ago. He said, I stayed in the company long after the grief should have been over. He said, I think I forgot how to come back out. She said, the Jeep, his brother's Jeep, the one he drove himself in on all the Thursdays. He said, yes. She felt something large and quiet settle in the room between them. The weight of what people carry, the specific weight of it, the years of it. She said, I think you came back out the day you found the napkin. He looked at her. She said, I think you were already on your way back, and the napkin just showed you which road. He said, Clara. She said, yes. He said, I would like to bring Ben to meet you. Properly, not just pie. He said, I would like him to know you. She looked at him. She said, that is the most serious thing you have said to me. He said, I know. She said, a man who brings a child to meet someone is saying something. He said, I am saying something. The gray-white December light came to the window, and Walter was at home waiting for her, and the soup was on the stove, and her mother's Christmas recipe, and the movie she had seen 8 times, and somewhere a boy named Ben was eating Christmas Eve pie, and his father was sitting in table 4, and neither of them was alone in quite the way they had been. She said, all right. He said, all right. She said, bring Ben to meet me. She stood up. She started to walk away. She stopped. She turned back. She said, "James." He said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you for keeping the napkin." He said, "Thank you for writing it." She went to the counter. She made herself a cup of coffee. She stood at the counter and looked at the diner, the vinyl booths, the one stoplight outside, the place that held something of her mother, and she felt, not happiness exactly, not yet, too early for that, but something that she would later describe as a particular feeling of a door you have forgotten was there opening just enough to let the air change. She drove home to Walter and the soup and the movie, and she sat on her couch with the cat in her lap, and she thought about the napkin. She thought about all the things you write at the end of a bad day that you think mean nothing. She thought about how nothing means nothing. The New Year came the way New Years come in small towns, quietly and without ceremony. Sable Creek did not have a fireworks show. There was no countdown on the one stoplight. There was a gathering at the VFW hall, and Roy went every year and came home at 9:30, because that was enough. Clara worked New Year's Eve until 8. She had asked for the night off and then taken it back, because Gil's wife had gone into the hospital for a procedure, and Gil needed to be there, and someone needed to cover, and she said she would. She worked until 8, and then Mercer told her to go, and he would close. She drove home at 8:15 on New Year's Eve, and she fed Walter, and she thought about where she was a year ago. She had been in the same apartment with the same cat. She had been $37 in her checking account and wet socks. She had been all the way at the bottom of something she could not have named at the time. She opened her phone. James had sent her a text. They had exchanged numbers in November, for reasons that had started as practical and had stopped being practical some time ago. And the text said, "Happy New Year, Clara May Hutchins." He had sent it at 11:58, 2 minutes before midnight. She sat there in her apartment at 12:02 on the first day of the New Year, and she typed back, "Happy New Year, James David Calloway." She put her phone down. She looked at Walter. She said, "Don't look at me like that." She said, "I know what I'm doing." Walter looked at her in a way cats look at you when they know exactly what you are doing and find it entertaining. Ben came to the diner on a Wednesday in the middle of January. He was 8 years old, and he had his father's careful eyes and his mother's easy smile, and he walked into Mercer's holding his father's hand and looked around with the particular focus of a child who is taking something seriously. Clara was behind the counter. She had known they were coming. James had texted the day before, and she had found herself, to her private embarrassment, thinking about what she was going to say to a child. She, who had talked to thousands of people across this counter. She, who had told a senator who came in once during a campaign stop that his eggs were getting cold without the slightest deference. She was nervous about an 8-year-old. Ben walked up to the counter, and he looked at her, and he said, "Are you Clara?" She said yes. He said, "My dad says you are the realest person he knows." Clara looked at James over the boy's head. James was looking at the ceiling with an expression that suggested he had not prepared for Ben to lead with that. She said, "Your dad is very kind." She said, "Do you want some pie?" Ben said yes. He said, "Warm." She said, "I remember." She got the pie, and she got them both set up at the counter, and she worked around them for the next 2 hours, running her section, but she kept coming back. She learned things about Ben. She learned he was in 3rd grade, and his best subject was math, and his worst was handwriting, because his hand went faster than his brain, which James said he came by honestly. She learned Ben had a goldfish named Champion, and a soccer jersey he had worn so many times it was starting to go transparent at the elbows. She learned he had told 3 kids at his school about a diner in Virginia that had the best pie in the world. She said, 3 kids? Ben said, maybe 4. She said, we might have to hire more help. Ben said, I could help. He said it with complete sincerity. Clara looked at James. James looked at his son with the expression of a person watching something they had hoped for, but not let themselves believe in. She said, you know what? I think you could. She gave Ben a cloth and let him wipe down the section of the counter in front of him with great seriousness and thoroughness. He did 3 passes. He held it up to the light to check. He nodded, satisfied. Roy came in at his usual time and sat at his end of the counter, and Ben turned to him immediately and said, Are you Roy? Roy adjusted his hearing aid and said, Last time I checked. Ben said, My dad says you come in every day and act like it's the first time you ever had eggs. Roy said, Well, He said, maybe it is. He said, maybe every morning you get to decide if it's the first time or the thousandth time. He said, I decided the first time a long time ago, and I've been having it the first time ever since. Ben thought about this. His face went through several stages. He said, that is the smartest thing I have heard today. He said, my teacher said something smart this morning, but this is smarter. Roy said, don't tell your teacher that. Ben said, I won't. Clara refilled Roy's coffee and met James's eyes over the counter, and she felt something move through her again, that fast thing, and this time she let move through before she filed it. When they were leaving, Ben turned at the door and waved at her. A real wave, not a polite one. The kind kids wave when they mean it. She waved back. She said to the counter after they left, to nobody. She said, well, she said it the same way she had said it 3 days before Christmas. Gil came through from the kitchen and said, that kid is something else. She said, yeah. She said, both of them are. February. James started calling her. Not texting. Calling. The way people used to call before texting became a way to communicate everything important without having to hear anyone's voice. He called on Tuesday nights, usually around 9, after his calls with Ben. He would say, I just got off with Ben. And then he would tell her something Ben said, some small marvel of the way 8-year-olds see the world. And she would tell him something from the diner that day, and they would talk for an hour without planning to. She started looking forward to Tuesday nights. She would not have said that out loud. She would not have told Mercer, who watched her with a patient expression she chose not to examine. She would not have told Roy, who would have made a comment that was both kind and mortifying. She said it to Walter, who maintained his editorial position of watching her with tolerant affection. She told herself she was not in love with him. She told herself as carefully and at length on several Tuesday nights after calls ended. She listed reasons why this was complicated and inadvisable. She listed them honestly because she was the kind of person who was honest even in her own head. She listed the car and the watch and the napkin and the $4 billion and the divorce and the son and the Jeep and the fact that she had $47 in her checking account and he had more buildings than she had had addresses. She told herself all of this. And then she thought about the way he said Ben's name. The way he said it like it was worth more than everything else he had ever said put together. She thought about the flannel shirts. She thought about the bus bin at Thanksgiving, and his hands learning to stack plates. She thought about East of Eden and the woman who could not imagine other people, and the way he had sat very still when she described it. She thought about Tom, his brother Tom, who died on a Tuesday in November, and the Jeep that had been Tom's and the way James had stayed in the company for 18 years, because grief finds the places you leave open and it moves in. She thought about her mother. She thought about this diner and why she stayed. She thought, this is a person who also stayed somewhere out of love for someone gone. She said to Walter, she said, this is a problem. Walter blinked. She said, I know, the first real fight. It happened in March, on a Thursday, and it came from a direction she did not expect. A woman came into the diner, late 30s professional, the kind of professional that travels. She had a phone to her ear and a carry-on bag, and she sat in Clara's section, and she ordered without looking up, and she said twice that her food was taking too long. The first time Clara said she would check on it. The second time the woman added, I have been waiting here 15 minutes, and I am a very busy person. It was not the woman's fault entirely. She was tired and running late, and she had no way of knowing that Clara had heard this particular song so many times she could sing it backward. She had no way of knowing about the 7 years and the $11 an hour and Roy and the napkin, and particular way to being told that someone else's time is more valuable than your time by someone who has never poured their own coffee. Clara said, I understand you're busy. I will bring your order as soon as it is ready. The woman said, can you check on it now? Please, I asked you to check 10 minutes ago, and I don't think I should have asked twice. Clara said, I checked when you asked. It was not ready. It is still not ready. When it is ready, I will bring it. The woman looked at her. The particular look. The one Clara had received 1,000 times. The look that was not angry exactly, but was something worse. Dismissive. The look that said, you are the hand that pours the coffee. And Clara, who had received this look 1,000 times and absorbed it each time with professional silence, said clearly and without raising her voice, "I have been working since 6 this morning. I have 11 tables right now. I am doing this as efficiently as it can be done. I am not your assistant. I am your server. There is a difference." The woman stared at her. Clara brought the food 3 minutes later. It was perfect. She set it down without ceremony and went to her next table. James was at table 4. He had seen all of it after the woman left. A 40% tip, which Clara later thought about as a tip of someone who knows they behaved badly, but cannot say it. James said, "Clara." She came over with the coffee pot. He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I am fine." He said, "That was..." She said, "Please don't." He said, "Please don't what?" She said, "Please don't feel sorry for me." She set the coffee pot down. She said, "That happens." She said, "I don't need..." He said, "I'm not feeling sorry for you." He said it with a firmness that stopped her. He said, "I think what you just said was exactly right, and I think it took a great deal of composure to say it the way you said it." He said, "I am not feeling sorry for you. I am sitting here thinking about all the times in 20 years I have been that woman." Clara went still. He said, "Not in a diner." He said, "In meetings, conference calls." He said, "I have told assistants that I have been waiting, and they should have anticipated that. I have told support staff that my needs were not complicated enough to require this much time." He said, "I have been that, and I said it with exactly that tone. And the people on the other end of it were..." He stopped. He looked at his coffee. He said, "They were exactly where you are right now. They were 11 hours in. They were doing their best. And I was telling them my time was worth more than theirs without using those exact words." Clara looked at him. He said, "I am not telling you this so you will feel better about what happened. I am telling you because I need to say it, and I need someone to hear it who will not tell me it was fine." She said, "It wasn't fine." He said, "I know." She picked up the coffee pot. She refilled his cup. She looked at him. She said, "Are you changing?" He said, "I am trying to." She said, "That is the right answer." She said, "Not I have changed." She said, "I am trying to is better." She said, "I have changed means you think you're done." He said, "I am a long way from done." She said, "Good." She walked away. She walked back to her section, and she felt, underneath everything, something she had not felt in a long time. Not the anger, not the exhaustion, not the invisibility. Something else. The feeling of being in the room with someone who was paying attention. The feeling of matching to someone's understanding of themselves. It was a very strange feeling to feel in the middle of a shift. She held on to it carefully. The thing nobody expected happened on a Saturday in April. James had mentioned, in a Tuesday phone call, that he had a thing in Charlottesville the following Saturday. An event, a charitable board thing, formal, the kind of thing he attended with professional face on. He had mentioned it the way people mention things they are not looking forward to. Clara had said, "Sounds terrible." He had said, "Would you come?" She had said what? He had said, "Would you come with me?" He said, "You don't have to dress a certain way or be a certain way or talk to people about things you don't care about." He said, I would like someone there who is honest." She said, "James, I work on Saturdays." He said, "It starts at 7 in the evening." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I don't have anything to wear to a thing like that." He said, "Wear whatever you want." She said, "That is very easy to say when you are you." He said, "I know." He said, "I will send you something if you'll let me." She said, "You are not sending me clothes." He said, "It is not a..." He paused. He said, "It is a very small gesture, and you can return it, and I would very much like you to be there." She was quiet for a long time. She said, "This is outside my comfort zone." He said, "Mine too." She said, "Why is it outside your comfort zone? You go to these things all the time." He said, "I go to them alone." He said, "Bringing someone means they are someone." She said, "I am someone." He said, "I know." He said, bringing someone to one of these things is a statement." He said, "I want to make that statement." She was quiet. She said, "James." He said, "Yes." She said, "I am going to say something direct." He said, "That surprises me." She said, "Shut up." She said, "I am going to say this, and I need you to hear it without the reflex. She said, I am not going to be a story. I am not going to be the man discovers meaning thing. I am not going to be the woman from the diner who teaches the billionaire how to feel. I am not that story. If that is what this is, I need you to say so right now. He was quiet. She said, James. He said, that is not what this is. She said, are you sure? He said, I am as sure of that as I am of anything. He said, Clara, I am not a person who has a lot of certainties left. He said, I have been wrong about most of the things I was certain of. He said, but I am certain that when I am talking to you, I am not looking at a lesson. He said, I am looking at a person. He said, the specific person. He said, you specifically? She said nothing. He said, and I would like to take that specific person to a boring charitable board event in Charlottesville and stand next to her and eat whatever they call food at these things and let her tell me honestly if the salmon is good or terrible. Clara let out a breath. She said, it is probably terrible. He said, almost certainly. She said, all right. She said, I will go. She said, do not send me clothes. He said, I won't. She wore a navy dress she had bought 4 years ago for a funeral and had never worn since. She did her own hair. She borrowed earrings from the woman in the apartment next to hers, a retired teacher named Gail who had been following the James situation with the intensity usually reserved for television drama and who produced the earrings from a drawer in under 30 seconds. James picked her up in the Jeep, his brother's Jeep. She got in and looked at him. He was in a jacket and no tie, and he looked different and also the same. The careful eyes. The thank you that minute. She said, nice Jeep. He said, it gets me where I need to go. She said, Tom would have liked that you drive it. He looked at her. Something moved through his face. She did not look away from it. She let it be there. He said, yeah. He said, I think he would have. He drove. The event was everything she had known it would be. It was in a large room with high ceilings and very small food and people in clothes that cost more than her car and music that was pretty but designed not to be listened to. She recognized the architecture of it immediately. The invisible hierarchy, the way people introduce themselves with their company names before their own names, the specific smile people deployed when they were assessing you, the way the room had a temperature that was not about the thermostat. She had spent 7 years learning to move through a room this way, reading the temperature, knowing where to be. She stood next to James. He did not introduce her with any particular framing. He said, this is Clara. And he said it the way he said everything, without excess, just the truth of it. Clara, full stop. People did the calculation. She watched them do it. She watched eyes go to the navy dress, the borrowed earrings, the absence of whatever markers they were used to looking for. She watched some of them decide, and some of them stay curious, and some of them make a face they were trying not to make. She was comfortable. This surprised her. She had expected to be uncomfortable. She was not. She had been looked through by experts. These people were amateurs. A man in his 50s, a name she did not retain, a company name she did not retain, said to her, and what is it that you do? Clara. She said, I am a server. He said, oh. He said, whereabouts? She said, Sable Creek, Mercer's Diner. 7 years. He said, ah. He deployed the smile, the assessment smile. She smiled back, not the professional smile she had worn for 7 years. Her actual smile, the one that reached her eyes and made her look like herself. She said, the meatloaf is extraordinary if you ever find yourself in Sable Creek. The man blinked. He said, I will keep that in mind. James, next to her, said, it really is. He said it with a completely straight face, and she had to look away from him to avoid laughing. Later, they were standing near the window with their terrible salmon, and she said, you did that on purpose. He said, I have no idea what you mean. She said, you kept a straight face on purpose. He said, the meatloaf is extraordinary. He said it again the same way. She laughed. Actually laughed, unguarded. The kind of laugh that happens to you rather than through you. James looked at her while she was laughing, and his face did the thing again. The thing she was beginning to understand, the thing that was small and quiet and entirely real. She stopped laughing and looked at him. He said, when you laugh, it is completely without apology. She said, what does that mean? He said, most people apologize for their laugh. They cover their mouths. They moderate it. They make it polite. He said, "You just laugh." She said, "I have never had time for a polite laugh." He said, "It is the best thing I have seen in a long time." She looked at him, the window behind him, the room of calculating smiles and terrible salmon, his face, which was honest in a way she had not expected from a man who had spent 20 years in boardrooms. She said, "James." She said it quietly. He said, "Yes." She said, "I am not going to overthink this." He said, "That is my approach to most things." She said, she stopped. She said, "I have spent a lot of my life being very careful about what I let matter." She said, "I have a very short list of things I let matter." She said, "This." She looked at the space between them. She said, "I am going to let this matter." He said nothing. He looked at her and said nothing. She said, "Now are you going to say anything, or are you just going to stand there?" He said, "I am trying to decide if this is the part where I am careful or the part where I am not careful." She said, "I have been on my feet for 11 hours every day for 7 years." She said, "We are not going to be careful." He said, "Clara." She said, "James." He said, "There is a bench in the courtyard outside this event that is probably not covered in surveillance." She said, "Only probably." He said, "Probably is all I have tonight." She said, "Let's go." They went outside. They sat on the bench in the April air, which was the right temperature for once, not hot and not cold, just the air being exactly what it was supposed to be. They sat, and she said, "I am going to ask you something." He said, "Ask." She said, "When you went back to that diner the second Thursday, when you drove 2 hours in the Jeep, what did you think was going to happen?" He said, "I had no idea." She said, "But you went." He said, "I went." She said, "Why?" He looked at the courtyard. He said, "Because I had the napkin, and I had read it every night for 3 weeks, and I had this feeling." He paused. He said, "I have spent 20 years making decisions. Big ones. The kind where you sit in a room, and you look at the numbers, and you weigh the risks, and you decide." He said, "This was not like that." He said, "This was the feeling I had when I was 24, and I had nothing. And I looked at this empty room in Richmond, and I thought, this is the place." He said, "I cannot explain that feeling in the language I usually use." He said, "It was just right. It was just clear." He said, "You were going to be important. I felt that the way I felt the room in Richmond." He said, "I just drove." Clara sat with this. She said, "That is either the most romantic thing anyone has said to me or the second most." He said, "What is the first?" She said, "Roy told me I reminded him of his wife when she was young." She said, "He said she also saved him the best piece of pie." James looked at her. He said, "I can't compete with Roy." She said, "Nobody can." She leaned back against the bench and looked at the April sky. She said, "I wrote on that napkin because I had nothing left that night." She said, "I want you to know that. I was empty." She said, "And the strange thing is, from empty I wrote the thing that—" She stopped. She said, "I don't know why things work out the way they do." She said, "My mother used to say that everything is trying to get to the right place, and some things take longer than others." He said, "Your mother sounds like she was something." She said, She said, "I think she would have found this very funny." He said, "The billionaire in the flannel shirt?" She said, "No." She said, "The napkin." She said, "Mom had a very specific sense of humor about things coming back around." She would have said, "See? Even the things you throw away know where they belong." James looked at her. He said, "Clara May Hutchins." She said, "James David Calloway." He said, "I would like to kiss you." He said it the way he said everything, direct and honest and slightly surprised by himself. She looked at him. She said, "I know." She said, "I have been watching you try to figure out the right way to say that for 6 weeks." He said, "Was it that obvious?" She said, "I serve people for a living. I know when someone is deciding something." He said, She said, "And we're sitting on a bench in April in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I am wearing a funeral dress and borrowed earrings, and you drove a Jeep with 200,000 miles on it, and I think that is exactly the right set of circumstances." He said, "I think so, too." He kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was not a movie kiss. It was a kiss between two people who had been circling toward each other since October, and who were both, at their core, people who got to the point. It was honest. It was warm. It was enough. When they pulled back, she looked at him and she felt, clearly and without apology, something she had not felt in so long she had stopped expecting to feel it. She said, "Your salmon was terrible, by the way." He said, "I know." She said, "Next Thursday, meatloaf." He said, "Next Thursday, meatloaf." Spring, the weeks after April, were a particular kind of time that Clara would later think about as the time before the hard thing. The time when things were new enough to feel like possibility and established enough to feel like they were real. James came on Thursdays and most Tuesdays. Ben came on Wednesdays. Roy met Ben 3 more times and gave him the same advice about eggs, and Ben quoted it back to his teacher, and his teacher did not know what to do with it. Clara and Walter relocated, temporarily. A flannel shirt of James's that she was not supposed to keep but kept anyway, to the end of her bed where Walter slept on it with great proprietary satisfaction. She went to Richmond once. James's house in McLean. He had not pushed. She had decided. She had driven her Civic, which he had offered to replace 3 times, and she had declined 3 times. The 2 hours to McLean, and she had stood in the driveway of a house that was large enough to contain her entire apartment building, and she had looked at it, and she had said to herself, "Okay, this is the thing. This is what we're dealing with." She had gone inside. The house was beautiful and cold. Not cold in temperature. Cold in a way that rooms that are too large for their occupant become cold. Too much space. Too little warmth. She walked through it, and James followed and let her look without explaining. In the kitchen, she opened the refrigerator. It contained 1 container of leftover takeout, some drinks, and condiments. She said, "James." He said, "Yes." She said, "You need to eat dinner." He said, "I know." She said, "This is not dinner." She went to pantry. Pasta, canned tomatoes, olive oil, garlic. She said, "Sit down." She made pasta. She made it in the kitchen of a $4 million house in McLean, Virginia, with pantry items, while James sat at the kitchen island and watched her with an expression of someone witnessing something they had missed without knowing they were missing it. Ben was not there that night. He was with Patricia, but there was a child's drawing on the refrigerator, a crayon drawing, a man and a boy and a dog they did not have, and at the bottom, in a child's careful printing, it said, "Dad and me." She stood at the stove and looked at the drawing. She said, "He draws well." James said he got that from Patricia's side. She said, "You should put more of them up." He said, "He only sent that one." She said, "Ask him for more." She said, "Ask him to send you a drawing of Champion the goldfish." She said, "Kids want to fill your walls." She said, "Let him fill your walls." James said nothing for a moment. He said, "Yeah." She said, "Refrigerator is not enough." She said, "This kitchen has a lot of wall." He said, "You're right." She made the pasta. They ate at the kitchen island. James ate 2 full portions and said that it was better than anything the house had produced in 4 years. She said, "That is because you made it with someone." He said, "I made nothing." She said, "You were here." She said, "That counts." He looked at her. He said, "Stay tonight." She looked at him. She said, "Mercer's at 6." He said, "I know." She said, "For our drive." He said, "I know." She looked at the drawing on the refrigerator. "Dad and me. An invisible dog." She said, "All right." She called Gail next door, who had been designated Walter's emergency contact, and told her to check on him in the morning. Gail said, "And?" Clara said, "And nothing." Gail said, "Clara May." Clara said, "Goodbye, Gail." She stayed. May brought the hard thing. She had known it was coming. She had known it the way you know a season is going to end. Not the exact day, but the inevitability of it. The way the air starts to taste different. The way certain things start to pull. She had known since April that something was building, and she had not asked because some part of her was not ready to hear it. James told her on a Thursday in May. He came in at 11:45, and he ordered his coffee, and she sat across from him because she could read him by now. She had been reading people for 7 years, and she could read this man across any surface. And she said, "What is it?" He said, "I need to talk to you about something." She said, "I know." He said, "The company is... there is a merger situation." He said, "It is large." He said, "It would require me to be in New York for an extended period." He said, "Not permanently." He said, "But the next 6 months, possibly more, would be..." He stopped. He said, "I would not be in Sable Creek most Thursdays." She sat across from him in table 4. and she felt the familiar shape of a thing she had felt before, the shape of something good that was about to become more complicated. She said, "How extended?" He said, "The current estimate is 6 to 8 months." He said, "I would be in New York most of the week." He said, "McLean on weekends when Ben is there." He said, "I could come to Sable Creek." He stopped again. She said, "Once a month." "Maybe." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you are telling me this because—" He said, "Because I need you to know, and I need to know if—" He stopped. He said, "Clara, I need to know if you will." He ran a hand over his face. He said, "I am saying this badly." He said, "I need to know if you are still in this if I am not here." She looked at him. She said, "Are you asking if I will wait?" He said, "I am asking if you want to—" She looked at the stoplight. She looked at her hands. She looked at the diner around her, the vinyl booths, Roy at the end of the counter, Gil in the back, the coffee ring on the counter where her napkin had been last October. 7 years of this place. 41 years of her life in this town. She said, "James, I have been waiting for things my whole life." She said, "I waited for my mother to get better, and she didn't." She said, "I waited for the right moment to do something different with my life, and the right moment kept not coming." She said, "I've been waiting." She said, "I know how to wait." He said, "That is not an answer." She said, "I know." She looked at him. She said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." He said, "Always." She said, "Is this—" She stopped. She said, "Are you going to go to New York and get back into the thing?" She said, "Are you going to get back into the company the way you were before?" She said, "Are you going to go back to being the person Patricia described?" He was quiet. She said, "I am not asking to be cruel. I am asking because I need to know if the flannel shirts are New York flannel shirts or if they go back in the closet." He said, "I don't know." She sat back. He said, "I want to tell you I won't." He said, "I want to tell you that this—" He gestured between them, at the diner, at Roy at the counter, at the space that held all of it. "I want to tell you this changed me completely and permanently." He said, "But I know myself." He said, "I know how the company pulls." He said, "I know what New York does to my head." He said, "I cannot make you a promise I do not know I can keep." He said, "I can make you this promise. I will try—" She looked at him. She said, "I am trying to is better than I have changed." He said, "I know." He said, "That is why I said it." She said, "Okay." He said, "Okay." She said, "Yes." She said, "You go to New York, and you do the merger, and you try. And you call on Tuesdays." She said, "And you bring Ben to Charlottesville when you can, and I will drive to McLean and make pasta when I can." She said, "And you do not disappear into the company." She said, "You do not become the window again." He said, "I won't." She said, "If you do, I will tell you." He said, "I know." She said, "I am not bluffing." He said, "I know you are not." She said, "Okay then." She stood up. She got the coffee pot. She refilled his cup. She looked at him. She said, "One more thing." He said, "Yes." She said, "The napkin." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to see it." He said, "It is in my office in Richmond." She said, "Before you go to New York, I want to see it." He said, "I'll take you." She said, "Good." She walked away. She refilled Roy's coffee. She ran her section. She was $11 an hour and a wet socks of mornings, and Walter at home, and her mother's recipe on Christmas Eve, and the most real person James Calloway knew. She was Clara May Hutchins, and she was going to be fine. 2 weeks later, she went to his office. She had not been to the Calloway Systems building before. She had seen it online, of course, after she did her research. A glass building in Richmond, 12 floors. The kind of building that makes a statement by pretending not to make a statement. All clean lines and environmental certifications. She drove up in the Civic and parked in the visitor lot and sat there for a moment. She thought about a woman in a diner at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, feet hurting, writing on a napkin. She thought about the distance between that moment and this parking lot. She went inside. Diane was waiting for her in the lobby. Diane, who had come to Mercer's and sat in her section and watched her for an hour and eaten none of her pie. Diane, who had called Patricia. Diane, who had written Napkin Woman in her notes. Diane said, "Clara Hutchins." Clara said, "Diane Chu." Diane looked at her for a moment with those sharp eyes. Then she smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. She said, "Follow me, 12th floor, James's office." Diane knocked twice and opened the door and stepped aside. Clara walked in. The office was not what she expected. She had expected something cold, something that matched the lobby, all glass and clean lines, and particular impersonality of very expensive things. The office had those things, but it also had the east wall. James was standing by the window when she came in, and he turned and he watched her face as she saw the east wall, and she did not look at him because she was looking at the wall. There were drawings, children's drawings, pinned in a grid with the careful precision of someone who had thought about how to hang them. Crayon drawings, marker drawings, pencil drawings, Champion the goldfish, a lopsided dog, a soccer field, a man and a boy holding hands, a diner. She recognized the shape of it, the approximation of it to an 8-year-old's eyes, Mercer's Diner, tiny and slightly wrong and entirely right. Roy at the counter, Clara herself in an apron which she could tell was her because of the name tag and the coffee pot. Ben had filled his father's walls. She stood there for a moment. She said, "When did he draw these?" James said, "I asked him in May. I asked him to send me drawings for my office." He said, "He sent the first one 2 days later." He said, "It has been about 2 a week since then." She counted. There were 27 drawings on the wall. She said, "James." He said, "I know." She said, "You have to cry at this." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said everything. She said, "If you are standing in this office looking at this wall, and you are not crying, you are the window again." He said, "I cried on the Thursday he sent me the one of Roy." She said, "Good." She looked at the wall for another minute. Then she turned. The frame was on the other wall. She had been avoiding it. The way you avoid the thing you came for in order to approach it properly. It was above his desk. Not too large. Simple frame, dark wood, clean glass. Inside it, the napkin. She walked toward it. She stood in front of it. She read her own handwriting. She read the coffee ring, preserved under glass. She read "I hate rich men" at the top in compressed, exhausted scrawl of a woman at the end of an 11-hour day. She read every word. She had written it in one sitting. Compressed and honest, in the last 10 minutes of a bad Tuesday in October. And it said everything that 7 years had compressed into her. It said the invisibility, and the $37, and the snap fingers, and the water glasses. It said the dreams that got worn down. It said the anger, and underneath the anger, the sadness, and underneath the sadness, the specific loneliness of feeling like the world had 2 kinds of people, and you were always going to be an invisible kind. She read it all. She turned back to James. He was watching her, still by the window. He had not moved. She said, "You put it here so you would see it every day." He said, "Yes." She said, "And does it work?" He said, "Every day." She said, "What does it do?" He said, "It reminds me that the world is full of people I cannot see unless I decide to see them." He said, "It reminds me that the truth is always simpler than the language I use to avoid it." He said, "It reminds me that there's a woman in a diner in a town with 1 stoplight who is the most honest person I have ever met, and that I want to be worth knowing to her." Clara looked at him. She said, "That is a lot for a napkin to do." He said, "It is a lot of napkin." She said, "James." He said, "Yes." She said, "I need you to do something." He said, "Tell me." She said, "Take the napkin out of the frame." He went still. He said, "Clara." She said, "Take it out of the frame." She said, "I am going to write you something new." She said, "It is not going to be as honest as the napkin." She said, "It is going to be different honest." She said, "The first one was written at the bottom." She said, "I am going to write you something from somewhere else." He looked at her for a long moment. He went to the frame. He took it off the wall. He opened the back carefully, and he slid the napkin out, and he held it. Clara opened her purse. She had brought a pen, the same kind she used at work, the one she kept in her apron pocket. Nothing special, just a pen. She had brought a piece of paper, not a napkin, just a piece of paper, plain white, from her notepad at home. She set it on his desk. She thought for a moment. She thought about what she wanted to say that was true. She wrote, "I have spent 7 years being invisible to rooms full of people. And then a man drove 2 hours every Thursday for a piece of meatloaf. And he looked at my face when he said, "Thank you." And he read the truth I threw away. And he drove a dead brother's Jeep to remember what mattered. I don't hate rich men. I hate invisibility. I hate the world that makes some people into furniture. I have spent my whole life asking to be seen. I didn't know I was writing to you when I wrote that napkin. I know it now. See me. I'll see you back. She stopped writing. She folded the paper. She held out her hand. He gave her the napkin. She put the napkin in her purse, in the outside pocket, not the separate one, not the one for things she hadn't decided about, the easy one, the one for things she was certain of. She held out the folded paper to him. He took it. He unfolded it. He read it. He read it the way he had read the napkin in October, standing very still, face not moving, eyes doing everything. When he finished, he looked at her. He said, "Clara May Hutchins." She said, "James David Calloway." He said, "I see you." She said, "I know you do." He left for New York in June. She drove him to the airport, not the regular airport, the small one, the one with the private planes. She had known this was a life, but standing in a small airport watching a private plane taxi and knowing it was his, was theirs, that was still a thing she had to adjust to, and she adjusted to it with the same matter-of-fact practicality she adjusted to everything. She drove him, and she parked the Civic, and she walked him with him, and they stood in the small terminal. He said, "Tuesdays." She said, "Tuesdays." He said, "I will try." She said, "I know you will." He said, "If you need anything." She said, "James." She said, "I have been managing my own life for a long time." She said, "I am not going to become someone who can't when things get complicated." He said, "I know that." She said, "But I will tell you if I need something." He said, "That is all I am asking." She said, "Okay." He picked up his bag. She said, "The flannel shirts." He said, "Yes." She said, "Take one to New York." He said, "I already packed 3. She said, "Good man." He walked through the door to the plane. He turned at the door and looked at her. She raised one hand. He raised one hand back. He went through the door. She stood there for a moment. She looked at the small airport terminal. She thought about October and the wet sock and the $37 and the napkin. She thought about the distance between that Tuesday night and this morning in June. She drove home to Walter and to Mercer's and to Roy and to Gill and to the one stoplight. June, July. The calls came on Tuesdays without exception. She came to look forward to them with a particular anticipation of something reliable, the way you look forward to Roy's face over the counter every morning, the way you look forward to certain things because their consistency is itself a kind of love. He called from New York, from conference rooms, from his penthouse, which he described once as a very tall box with an excellent view of other boxes. He called from a car once, stuck in traffic, and she could hear the city through the phone, the layered sound of it, and she sat on her couch with Walter, and she thought about 2 hours and one stoplight. He was not the window. He was not the invisible man who forgot to come back. He was present on the phone the way he was present in Table 4. All the way. She could hear it. The way he listened. The way he asked her about Roy and Gill and Ben's latest drawings, and what Mercer had said that week. The way he remembered things she had said 3 weeks ago and came back to them. He was paying attention. She told him everything. She told him about the couple who had come in for their 50th anniversary, and Mercer had put a little cake on the table without charging them, and the woman had cried with happiness. She told him about the time Gill had accidentally made the meatloaf with too much pepper, and every person who ordered it that day had hiccuped through their meal. She told him about the morning she had found Roy asleep at the counter, just asleep, having arrived before they opened and settled in and dozed off, and she had let him sleep for 40 minutes before she needed the stool. He said, "That is the best story I have heard this week." He said this in a week where he had been in rooms with people making decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She said, "Roy is the best story every week." He said, "Send him my regards." She said, "Roy does not know your name. He knows you as the young man who came to sit with him." James said, "I am 46. She said, "What does it do?" He said, "It reminds me that the world is full of people I cannot see unless I decide to see them." He said, "It reminds me that the truth is always simpler than the language I use to avoid it." He said, "It reminds me that there's a woman in a diner in a town with one stoplight who is the most honest person I have ever met, and that I want to be worth knowing to her. Clara looked at him. She said, "That is a lot for a napkin to do." He said, "It is a lot of napkin." She said, "James." He said, "Yes." She said, "I need you to do something." He said, "Tell me." She said, "Take the napkin out of frame." He went still. He said, "Clara." She said, "Take it out of frame." She said, "I am going to write you something new." She said, "It is not going to be as honest as the napkin." She said, "It is going to be different honest." She said, "The first one was written at the bottom." She said, "I am going to write you something from somewhere else." He looked at her for a long moment. He went to the frame. He took it off the wall. He opened the back carefully, and he slid the napkin out, and he held it. Clara opened her purse. She had brought a pen, the same kind she used at work, the one she kept in her apron pocket. Nothing special, just a pen. She had brought a piece of paper, not a napkin, just a piece of paper, plain white, from her notepad at home. She set it on his desk. She thought for a moment. She thought about what she wanted to say that was true. She wrote, "I have spent 7 years being invisible to rooms full of people." And then a man drove 2 hours every Thursday for a piece of meatloaf. And he looked at my face when he said, "Thank you." And he read the truth I threw away. And he drove a dead brother's Jeep to remember what mattered. I don't hate rich men. I hate invisibility. I hate the world that makes some people into furniture. I have spent my whole life asking to be seen. I didn't know I was writing to you when I wrote that napkin. I know it now. See me. I'll see you back. She stopped writing. She folded the paper. She held out her hand. He gave her the napkin. She put the napkin in her purse, in the outside pocket, not the separate one, not the one for things she hadn't decided about, the easy one, the one for things she was certain of. She held out the folded paper to him. He took it. He unfolded it. He read it. He read it the way he had read the napkin in October, standing very still, face not moving, eyes doing everything. When he finished, he looked at her. He said, "Clara May Hutchins." She said, "James David Calloway." He said, "I see you." She said, "I know you do." He left for New York in June. She drove him to the airport, not the regular airport, the small one, the one with the private planes. She had known this was a life, but standing in a small airport watching a private plane taxi, and knowing it was his, was theirs, that was still a thing she had to adjust to, and she adjusted to it with the same matter-of-fact practicality she adjusted to everything. She drove him, and she parked the Civic, and she walked him with him, and they stood in the small terminal. He said, "Tuesdays." She said, "Tuesdays." He said, "I will try." She said, "I know you will." He said, "If you need anything." She said, "James." She said, "I have been managing my own life for a long time." She said, "I am not going to become someone who can't when things get complicated." He said, "I know that." She said, "But I will tell you if I need something." He said, "That is all I am asking." She said, "Okay." He picked up his bag. She said, "The flannel shirts." He said, "Yes." She said, "Take one to New York." He said, "I already packed 3. She said, "Good man." He walked through the door to the plane. He turned at the door and looked at her. She raised one hand. He raised one hand back. He went through the door. She stood there for a moment. She looked at the small airport terminal. She thought about October and the wet sock and the $37 and the napkin. She thought about the distance between that Tuesday night and this morning in June. She drove home to Walter and to Mercer's and to Roy and to Gill and to the one stoplight. June, July. The calls came on Tuesdays without exception. She came to look forward to them with a particular anticipation of something reliable, the way you look forward to Roy's face over the counter every morning, the way you look forward to certain things because their consistency is itself a kind of love. He called from New York, from conference rooms, from his penthouse, which he described once as a very tall box with an excellent view of other boxes. He called from a car once, stuck in traffic, and she could hear the city through the phone, the layered sound of it, and she sat on her couch with Walter, and she thought about 2 hours and one stoplight. He was not the window. He was not the invisible man who forgot to come back. He was present on the phone the way he was present in Table 4. All the way. She could hear it. The way he listened. The way he asked her about Roy and Gil and Ben's latest drawings. and what Mercer had said that week. The way he remembered things she had said 3 weeks ago and came back to them. He was paying attention. She told him everything. She told him about the couple who had come in for their 50th anniversary, and Mercer had put a little cake on the table without charging them, and the woman had cried with happiness. She told him about the time Gil had accidentally made the meatloaf with too much pepper, and every person who ordered it that day had hiccuped through their meal. She told him about the morning she had found Roy asleep at the counter, just asleep, having arrived before they opened and settled in and dozed off, and she had let him sleep for 40 minutes before she needed a stool. He said, "That is the best story I have heard this week." He said this in a week where he had been in rooms with people making decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She said, "Roy is the best story every week." He said, "Send him my regards." She said, "Roy does not know your name. He knows you as the young man who came to sit with him." James said, "I am 46. She said, "To Roy you are young." She said, "You should take that." He said, "I take it." In July, he came back to Sable Creek for a long weekend. He came back in the Jeep. He came to the diner and ate at table 4, and Clara put in a meatloaf, and she did not sit with him for the first hour because she had tables, but she looked at him across the room the whole hour, this man in his flannel shirt reading his paperback. And he was not the magazine cover, and he was not the building in Richmond, and he was not the $4 billion. He was a man at table 4 with a coffee and a book and the careful eyes. That weekend they drove around the county in the Jeep with no destination, and she showed him the things she knew. The road where the autumn leaves were best, the old farm stand that was open 3 months of the year and sold a cider she could drink without stopping. She showed him the small cemetery outside of town where her mother was buried under a cedar tree, and she stood there quiet, and he stood next to her quiet, and neither of them said anything, and that was correct. She showed him all of it, her life, 41 years in this landscape, the things that were small and the things that held everything. He looked at all of it. He said, "You built something here." She said, "I just stayed." He said, "Staying is building." She looked at him. She said, "You should use that one." She said, "Tell that to Ben someday." He said, "I will." August brought the twist. She had not seen it coming. She had been careful. She had been honest. She had been present. She had done everything right, and still the thing came. A journalist, not a bad journalist, not a tabloid, a business magazine, the kind with serious credentials and serious writers who took their subject seriously. A journalist named Parker, who had been doing a profile on James for 3 months and who had, in the course of reporting, become aware of the Sable Creek situation, not through James, through someone at the event in Charlottesville in April, someone who had seen Clara in the Navy dress and had been doing calculations and had eventually put the name into a system. The article was going to publish in September. The journalist called James first. James called Clara on a Tuesday night in August, and he said, "I need to tell you something." She said, "Tell me." He told her about the article. He said, "They are going to write about you." He said, "They have your name. They know you work at Mercer's." He said, "They are going to describe you as my—" He stopped. He said, "My companion." He said, "They are not going to be cruel about it." He said, "Parker is a responsible journalist." He said, "But they are going to print it." Clara said nothing. He said, "I can try to. There are things I can ask them not to." She said, "James." He said, "Yes." She said, "I need a minute." She put the phone down. She sat in her apartment in Sable Creek, Virginia, with Walter on her lap and the window open to the August night, and she thought about it. She thought about Mercer's and Roy and the stoplight, and her $11 an hour, and her 187,000-mile car. She thought about a business magazine with serious credentials. She thought about the napkin framed in his office, and what it would mean to have that story in the world. She thought about her mother. She thought about what her mother would have said. Her mother had been the kind of woman who said, "The truth is the only thing you never have to keep track of." She said, "The truth does not require maintenance." Clara picked up the phone. She said, "James." He said, "Yes." She said, "Call the journalist back." He said, "What?" She said, "Call Parker back and tell him I will talk to him." She said, "But not about you." She said, "About the napkin." She said, "I want to tell the napkin story myself." She said, "If it is going to be told, I want to be the one who tells it." James was quiet for a moment. He said, "Clara," she said, "I am not going to hide." She said, "I have been hiding my whole life." She said, "Not intentionally." She said, "I have been invisible my whole life. I have been the hand that pours the coffee." She said, "If a serious journalist wants to tell the story of a woman in a diner who wrote on a napkin, I want that woman to be a full person in the story, not a detail." He said, "That is," he stopped. She said, "James." He said, "Yes." She said, "You looked at my face when you said thank you, and I noticed because nobody did that." She said, "I am asking you to see this now." She said, "This is me being seen. This is what it looks like. It looks like a woman in Sable Creek, Virginia, giving an interview to a business magazine." He said, "Okay." She said, "Okay." He said, "I will call Parker." The interview was conducted at Mercer's Diner. Clara's choice. Parker, the journalist, was a woman in her late 30s with a recorder and a notebook and the particular quality of attention that very good journalists share with very good waitresses. The ability to make you feel like the most important person in the room. Clara recognized it and appreciated it and trusted it. They talked for 2 hours. Clara told the truth. All of it. The 7 years. The $11 an hour. The snapped fingers and the water glasses and the men who never looked at her face. She told without anger and without performance. Just the facts of a life, the weight of them, the texture. She told about the bad Tuesday in October. She told about the napkin. She told it the way it actually happened. Not a love story, not yet, just a woman at the end of herself writing the truth on a disposable thing, because there was no one else to tell. She told about the first Thursday, the coffee. Thank you, and he meant it. Her name tag. She told about the hundreds of dollars under the coffee cup, and the bus bin at Thanksgiving in East of Eden, and the meatloaf, and the bench in April, and the flannel shirts, and the Jeep that was his brother's. She told about Ben and warm pie. She told about Roy. Parker asked, "And the napkin is framed in his office." Clara said, "Yes." Parker said, "What does that mean to you?" Clara sat for a moment. She looked at the counter, the stool behind the counter, the stoplight outside. She said, "It means the things we throw away know where they belong." She said, "It means the truth finds its frame eventually." She said, "I wrote something at the end of a very bad day and threw it away, and it ended up meaning something to someone who needed it to mean something." She said, "I think that is the most hopeful thing I know." Parker wrote it down. Clara said, "Also, the meatloaf is extraordinary." She said, "You should have some while you are here." Parker laughed. Clara got up and put in an order. September. The article. It came out on a Thursday. Of course it did. The headline was, "The Napkin and the Billionaire. What a diner in Virginia taught one of America's richest men to pay attention." Clara read on her phone in the parking lot of Mercer's before her shift. She read it the way she read East of Eden, all the way through without stopping. Parker had done it right. She had made Clara a full person. She had not made her a lesson or a symbol or a punchline. She had made her Clara May Hutchins, 41 years old, 7 years at Mercer's Diner, the woman who wrote the truth on a napkin and threw it away. She had made James a full person, too. Not the $4 billion. The boy in the hardware store. The brother's Jeep. The 18 years of grief that looked like ambition. The flannel shirts and the bus bin. And the 12-year process of becoming someone his son could recognize. The article ended with Clara's words. The truth finds its frame eventually. Clara sat in the parking lot for a long time after she finished reading. She called James. He picked up on the first ring. She said, "Parker did it right." He said, "I know. I read it an hour ago." She said, "Are you all right?" He said, "People keep sending me messages." He said, "A lot of them." She said, "What kind of messages?" He said, "The kind that are..." He stopped. He said, "There's a woman who messaged and said she had been a server for over 20 years, and she read the article on her break, and she sat in her car and cried." He said, "There's a man who said he is the CEO of a company, and he started at minimum wage, and he forgot." He said, he put the article in his desk. Clara was quiet. James said, "Roy called." She said, "Roy called you?" She said, "Roy has your number?" He said, "Ben gave it to him." He said, "Roy said to tell you he has been having the first time every day for 40 years, and he plans to keep going." Clara pressed her hand over her eyes. She said, I am going to have words with Ben about giving out phone numbers. James said, Roy also said thank you. She said, for what? James said, for the article. For saying what you said about him. Roy said he has not had that many people look at him since his wife was alive. Clara did not say anything for a moment. She said, James. He said, yes. She said, I need to get to work. He said, I know. She said, Tuesdays. He said, Tuesdays. He said, and Clara. She said, yes. He said, thank you. She said, I know. She got out of her car and smoothed her apron, and she walked into Mercer's diner, and Roy was at the counter with his eggs over easy and white toast and coffee with 2 sugars, and he said good morning like it was the first morning. She said, good morning, Roy. She got the coffee. October. 1 year from a napkin. She had not planned to make something of it. She had not mentioned it to James. She had thought about it and decided that anniversaries of napkins were a slightly ridiculous thing to mark, and she was not the kind of person who marked slightly ridiculous things. And then James showed up on a Tuesday, not a Thursday, a Tuesday, the specific Tuesday, October 14th. At exactly the time it would have been 1 year ago from when she wrote the napkin. He walked in at 9:45 in the evening, 15 minutes before closing, in the flannel shirt, the blue one, her favorite of the flannel shirts, and he sat down at the counter. Not table 4, the counter. Clara said, what are you doing? He said, I came to see where it happened. She said, the counter. She said, right here. He said, right there. She said, you drove 2 hours. He said, I took the Jeep. She said, of course you did. She put a cup of coffee in front of him. She sat on the stool, the one behind the counter, the one Mercer always told her not to sit on. She sat on it. He looked at her. He said, 1 year. She said, 1 year. He said, I have a question for you. She said, ask. He said, would you leave Sable Creek? She went still. He said, I'm not asking you to leave. He said, I am asking if you would. He said, there's a difference. He said, I need to know the shape of what you want before I say the thing I am going to say. She thought about it honestly. She thought about Mercer's and Roy and Gil, and the stoplight, and her mother, and the cedar tree, and the cider from the farm stand, and the town with 6,000 people, and the one road that she had driven so many times she drove it in her sleep. She said, I don't know. He said, that is honest. She said, I think I could. She said, not easily. She said, there are things here that are not portable. She said, Roy. She said, Mercer. She said, the tree. She said, those things stay here. She said, but the thing about a life is, she thought about her mother. She said, the thing about a life is that it is yours to carry. She said, you carry the things that matter, and you put them down where you land. He said, Clara. She said, yes. He said, I have been thinking about what it means to be where you are. He said, I have been in New York for 4 months in a very tall box, and I have been thinking about Sable Creek every day. He said, I have been thinking about Roy eating his first morning every morning. He said, I have been thinking about Ben's drawings on the wall. He said, I have been thinking about a woman who sat on a stool she was not supposed to sit on and wrote the truth on a napkin at the end of a bad day. He said, I have been thinking about where I want to be. She said, and he said, I want to be where you are. She looked at him. He reached into the inside pocket of the flannel shirt. Always a pocket in the front, always the same pocket. And he took out something. Small, not a napkin, a ring. She looked at it. He said, I bought this in May. He said, I bought it in May and I put it in the pocket. And every Thursday when I drove to Sable Creek, I thought about whether this was the right time, and every Thursday I decided it was not quite the right time yet. He said, and tonight I was in New York at 9 o'clock, and I thought, October 14th. He said, I got in the Jeep. She looked at the ring. Simple. A single stone. The exact opposite of showy. The ring of a man who had spent time thinking about what she was. She said, James David Calloway. He said, yes. She said, you drove 2 hours on a Tuesday night. He said, I drove 2 hours on a Tuesday night. She said, for the second time. He said, for the second time. She said, you know, I'm going to say something about Roy and about bringing Ben and about the thing that has to happen before a person says yes to something. He said, I know. She said, and you have thought about all of that. He said, I have thought about almost nothing else for 5 months. She looked at the ring. She looked at his face. The careful eyes. The thank you that minute. The flannel shirt. The Jeep in the parking lot with Tom's miles on it. She said, Ben has to think I am good enough for his dad. He said, Ben has been asking me since February why you don't live with us. She said nothing. He said, Ben told me last month that Champion the goldfish is lonely and needs a companion. He said, I am fairly sure he was not talking about the fish. Clara looked at the ceiling. She said, Roy. She looked back at him. She said, I need Roy to know. He said, I will drive to Roy's house right now if you say yes. She said, James, it is 10 o'clock. He said, I will leave a note. She sat on the stool. She looked at the counter where the napkin had been. The coffee ring was still there, on the formica, the ghost of it, a ring of light caramel color that had never completely come out in a year of wiping. She thought about throwing something away and it knowing where to go. She said, Yes. He looked at her. She said, Yes. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it on her hand. The hand that had poured 10,000 cups of coffee and written 10,000 orders and folded one napkin on a bad Tuesday and left it for the world to do with what it would. She said, I am still a waitress. He said, I know. She said, I am not going to stop being a waitress because... He said, I know, Clara. She said, Mercer's is not going anywhere. He said, I know. She said, Roy needs me here. He said, we will figure out Roy. She said, and Walter is not going to like moving. He said, I have already spoken to Walter about this. She said, you have not. He said, I may have made peace with him over 3 separate visits to the apartment while you were working. She said, James David Calloway, you have been negotiating with my cat. He said, he drove a hard bargain. He said, I have agreed to the flannel shirt arrangement being permanent. She said, the flannel shirt on the end of the bed. He said, yes. She laughed. The unguarded laugh. The one without apology. She laughed in Mercer's Diner at 10 o'clock on October 14th, 1 year from a napkin, and James Calloway watched her laugh and felt the thing he always felt. The word he'd been looking for since April. The word that had been circling without landing. Home. He fell home. She stopped laughing and looked at him. She said, you know this is insane. He said, completely. She said, I wrote, I hate rich men on a napkin. He said, and I framed it. She said, and now. He said, and now. She looked at the ring. She looked at the counter. The coffee ring ghost. The stool she was not supposed to sit on. She said, Mercer's going to have to hire another server. He said, let him. Ben drew a new picture. It was Clara and James and Walter the cat and Roy and Champion the goldfish and Mercer's Diner and the one stoplight and a Jeep. The Jeep was very large in the picture. Ben drew it taking up almost a third of the page, which James thought was right. He put it in the middle of the east wall. Clara trained her replacement at Mercer's. Trained her with the same thoroughness she had given to everything. The warm pie. The memory for orders. The looking at faces when you say thank you. The sitting with Roy. She trained all of it. She was not done with the diner. She went on Thursdays. She and James bought a house between Sable Creek and Richmond. Not too far from either. Not too close to anything in particular. A house with a kitchen she could cook in and walls that could hold drawings and a yard that Walter regarded with the skepticism of a cat who had been an apartment cat his entire life and was not convinced this grass situation was an improvement. He came around. The napkin stayed in the outer pocket. There came a day, a Thursday. Naturally, it was always a Thursday for the important things. When Claire and James were at Mercer's and the dinner rush had just ended and the room was that particular post-rush quiet, and Roy was at his end of the counter with his evening decaf, and Mercer was in the back, and the stoplight was going through its colors. Ben was there too. He had come for the pie. He was 11 now and getting taller. And he had his father's careful eyes and his mother's easy smile, and he had Clara's directness in his voice, which James noticed and said nothing about because it made him feel something he had no word for. Ben said, Dad. He said, tell me the napkin story again. James looked at Clara. Clara looked at James. She reached into the outer pocket of her purse. She put the napkin on the counter. Ben leaned in. He had heard this story many times. He still leaned in every time. This is the thing about the right story. You can hear it many times, and each time it is the first time. Clara said, I wrote this on a very bad Tuesday, when I had been on my feet all day, and nobody had looked at my face. Ben said, and then, she said, and then a man came in on a Thursday and read it and put it in his pocket. Ben said, why? Clara looked at James. James said, because it was the truth. He said, because I had forgotten what the truth sounded like, and it woke me up. Ben said, and then you kept coming back. James said, every Thursday. Ben said, and then you fell in love. James said, eventually. Ben said, and then you asked her to marry you. James said, yes. Ben said, and it worked. Clara said, and it worked. Ben looked at the napkin. He said, I hate rich men. He said the words slowly and seriously. He said, it doesn't really sound like a love story. Clara said, the best love stories never do at the beginning. Ben sat with this. He nodded slowly, with the nod of a person absorbing something. He said, can I have a piece of pie? She said, warm? He said, warm. She went and got the pie. She brought 3 pieces back. 1 for Ben, 1 for James, 1 for herself. She sat on the stool, the one behind the counter. Roy raised his decaf cup in their direction. The stoplight outside went from red to green. Clara May Hutchins picked up her fork, and she ate the pie, and it was warm, and it was sweet, and it was October in a diner that held her mother and the ghost of a napkin, and a boy who came in every day for the first time, and a man who drove 2 hours in his dead brother's Jeep, because the truth had woken him up, and he would not go back to sleep. Nothing goes nowhere. Everything is trying to get to the right place. Some things take longer than others. And some things, some cheap, wrinkled, coffee stain, disposable things that you write on a bad day and throw away without thinking. Some things know exactly where they belong. They always did. For every person who has ever poured coffee for someone who did not look at their face. You were seen. You are seen. You always will be.